Welcome back to The Discoverers. This is Chapter 76, Hidden Dimensions, History as Therapy. The discovery of prehistory had come from the simple effort to arrange artifacts of the distant past into an intelligible order. There was an impenetrable mystery about when and by whom a stone axe had been made, but there seemed no similar uncertainty about man's thought. Ideas were believed to be universal and immutable. Descartes, in his Discourse on Method, 1637, had insisted on the universality, uniformity, and constancy of man's reason, which he expressed in the familiar proposition, I think, therefore I am. The world of mind was eternally separate from the physical world of experience and of history. Locke, in his Essay Concerning Human Understanding in 1690, began to relate mind to history by making experience the source of ideas, and knowledge the perception of the agreement or disagreement of ideas. But according to Locke, too, reason and the senses operated constantly and uniformly, and the processes of thinking were proof of a universal and eternal mind. Man's ideas, from these various points of view, remained the product of a homogeneous process. A revolutionary new discovery, or at least a pregnant suggestion, was that man's ideas might be nothing but human artifacts, merely symptoms of changing experience. Then the process by which men acquired what passed for knowledge would not be uniformly rational, nor would that knowledge be universal and changeless. Perhaps some forces other than reason were at work. Did ideas themselves have a history? A pioneer explorer of this question was the unhappy Italian philosopher Giambattista Vico, 1668 to 1744. The son of a poor bookseller, he had a nearly fatal fall on his head at the age of 7, when doctors predicted that he might become an imbecile. Vico himself said this accident explained his lifelong melancholy. Yet despite poverty, repeated depressions, and an attack of typhus, Vico, from his professorship of rhetoric in Naples, managed to finance publication of his writings. Ignored by contemporaries, he came into his own in the late 18th century when Goethe made Vico's prophetic insights the basis of his own philosophy of history. In the 19th century, the eloquent French romantic Michelet called him, quote, his own Prometheus. And Marx, too, learned much from him. Born into the generation after Newton that was ebullient with the promise of natural science, Vico declared in his Principles of New Science, concerning the common nature of the nations in 1725, quote, that the world of civil society has certainly been made by men, and that its principles are therefore to be found within the modifications of our own human mind. Whoever reflects on this cannot but marvel that the philosophers should have bent all their energies to the study of the world of nature, which, since God made it, he alone knows, and that they should have neglected the study of the world of nations, which, since men had made, men could come to know. End of quote. According to Vico, the changing relationship of past peoples to the forces of nature explained their ways of thinking. In the most primitive stage, the age of the gods, fearful men were governed by religion and ruled by priest-kings. Then, in an age of heroes, to escape the bestial struggle for survival, people put themselves under the protection of strong men. Quote, this law of force is the law of Achilles, who referred every right to the tip of his spear. End of quote. Finally, in an age of peoples, the plebeians who had accumulated wealth asserted themselves in, quote, human law dictated by fully developed human reason, end of quote. Each stage brought forth its characteristic literature. For example, the Homeric poems were not the product of one talented bard, but the unconscious expression of the whole age of heroes. Quote, Homer was an idea, or a heroic character of Grecian men insofar as they told their histories in song, end of quote. When poetry gave way to prose in the Age of Peoples, the customs of religion were replaced by written codes that defined rights and privileges. Social classes were not ordained by God, but emerged from this progressive development and brought new ways of thought. The last stage of the cycle, producing ease and luxury, always ended in decadence. The society then relapsed, but never quite back to its earlier stage. The progress of humanity was an upward spiral, ascending by the beneficence of a divine providence. The crucial novelty in Vico's new science was his treatment of ideas and institutions, accepting only Christianity itself, as mere symptoms of social experience. Man's reason, too, was the product of gradual development. If Vico was correct, then, of course, his own ideas had no absolute validity, but were a byproduct of the age of peoples. He tried to avoid this logical consequence simply by declaring Christianity to be the one true religion for all societies. And Vico's new science would liberate mankind from fears by making people conscious of how their thoughts were shaped. Then they could take charge of their destiny and shape institutions toward desired ends. Karl Marx, 1818 to 1883, grew up at the end of the century of Adam Smith, James Watt, and Thomas Jefferson, of rising nations, growing colonies, expanding factories, and burgeoning capitalism. He would find hidden dimensions of the past in the forces of production then dramatically exploding in Western Europe. The story of Karl Marx's life, like that of Vico's, is an almost unrelieved tale of personal frustration, flight, and tragedy. Born in Trier, in Prussia, he was descended from a long line of rabbis on both sides of his family, an inheritance that biographers recognize in his inclination to dialectics and philosophical debate. His father was a brilliant lawyer, an admirer of Voltaire, and an active advocate of a constitution for Prussia. As a practical necessity for a career in the law, he converted to Christianity before Karl was born. Marx's Dutch mother was no intellectual and spoke German with an accent all her life. She was baptized when Karl was only 7, and he was also baptized about that time, in the year when Heinrich Heine was taking the same step, called his baptism, quote, an entrance card into the community of European culture, end of quote. For his university education, he followed a familiar German pattern, moving from one place to another according to the appeal of different professors or of the student life. He sowed his wild oats at Bonn, where for drunken rowdiness he actually spent 24 hours in the university jail, which would be the only imprisonment of his life. His father insisted that he transfer to Berlin to study law and philosophy. Although two famous German historians, von Wränke and von Savigne, were lecturing there at the time, Marx was most influenced by the philosophy of Hegel being preached by a charismatic young docent, Bruno Bauer. He joined the Doctors' Club of young Hegelians who met to debate the social implications of Hegel's idealistic doctrines, which would stay with Marx throughout his life. He seemed unable to forget any theory he had once encountered, and was adept at making it either a foundation or a foil for his own restless philosophizing. A vivid doggerel description of the Marx whom he had not yet met but about whom he heard was composed by Friedrich Engels, 1820 to 1895, and this is translated from the German by Saul Padover. Who rushes behind with wild bluster? A swarthy fellow from Trier, a vigorous monster. He walks not, hops not, he leaps on his heels and raves full of rage, as if he wanted to seize the broad canopy of heaven and pull it down to earth, his arms extended very wide in the air. With angry fist balled, he rants ceaselessly, as if 10,000 devils held him by the forelock. His doctor's dissertation on the arcane subject of, quote, the difference between the Democritian and Epicurean philosophy of nature, end of quote, brought him his degree from Jena in 1841. Quote, the glorification of the heavenly body, he explained, is a cult which all Greek philosophers celebrate. It is the intellectual solar system. Hence, the Greek philosophers, in worshipping the heavenly bodies, worshipped their own mind, end of quote. In Cologne, as editor of a new liberal paper, the Rheinische Zeitung, financed by the city's enterprising merchants, Marx advocated various social causes, opposed censorship, and championed freedom of the press, including the freedom to examine such novel notions as communism. Within a year, he was forced out, The paper was banned by the Prussian government, and he was on his way to Paris. After a 7-year engagement, in 1843, he married Jenny von Westphalen, who was the unflickering gleam of happiness in his life. In Paris, Marx earnestly studied the movements of French and German workers who were organizing a communist league and a secret society called the League of the Just. He began his collaboration with the 24-year-old Engels, wrote his first works on French politics and economics, and an article calling for the, quote, uprising of the proletariat, end of quote. He also began to develop his polemics against religion in general, which he unforgettably stigmatized as, quote, the opium of the people. Heinrich Heine, also in Paris at the time, was amused at his, quote, stubborn friend Marx and the rest of the godless, self-appointed gods, end of quote. When the French government expelled Marx, he fled to Brussels, where he registered as an alien, impetuously took the legal steps to renounce his Prussian citizenship, and at the age of 28, committed himself to a life of exile. During his stay in Brussels, which lasted 3 years, he joined with Engels to write the Communist Manifesto for the Communist League, which had been meeting in London. In place of the League's old motto, quote, all men are brethren, Marx substituted his rousing, quote, proletarians of all countries, unite, end of quote. When the liberal revolutions of 1848 broke out in Western Europe, Marx fled back to Cologne, where he revived the Rheinische Zeitung and attacked both the partisans of representative democracy and their radical opponents. Again banished, he returned briefly to Paris. Expelled once more, in 1849 he arrived in London, his principal habitat for the rest of his life. If he had any home during the remaining 34 years of his life, it was the library of the British Museum. Before he arrived in London, Marx had produced a whole sheaf of polemical pamphlets trying to find his bearings at the same time in philosophy, in history, and in the eruptive politics of his age. His attitude toward violent revolutionary action was vacillating. Although he had exhorted working men of all countries to unite, he usually advised against armed rebellion. At least once, he and Engels publicly urged that their Communist Manifesto should be put aside. He became accustomed to attack, both by conservatives who saw him as an agitator for anarchy and by militant socialists who stigmatized him as a capitalist lackey. The constant current in his thought was faith in his own evolving theory of history and his ironic belief that ideas and political movements really could not change the course of history. And here I will pause until we continue with part 2 of chapter 76.